Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history, the Maya. Let's try to figure out who they really were, because whenever the Maya come up, it's always in the same kind of context. The 2012 apocalypse, mysterious wells hundreds of feet deep, a ball game played to the death, mass human sacrifice. And I've only listed the greatest hits. There's plenty more where that came from. But here's the thing, I don't want to just debunk myths. What's way more interesting is asking a different question entirely. Who were these people, actually? The Maya were a genuinely parallel branch of human civilization. They were brewing booze from cacao, played ball with the heads of their enemies, and never invented the wheel. Why? The answer is actually pretty surprising, but we'll get to that. Here's the really strange part, though. When the Spanish arrived on these lands, the Maya civilization was already gone, had been for centuries, which raises an obvious question. If it didn't exist anymore, how do we know anything about it at all? You might think the answer is simple. Columbus discovers America, the Spanish sail over, they run into the Aztecs, the Incas, the Maya, and there you go. But the reality is far more complicated. By the time the conquistadors arrived, the Maya civilization had been dead for centuries. So long ago, in fact, that even the local descendants had almost no memory of their own ancestors. To the rest of the world, the Maya appeared out of nowhere. In the mid-1700s, in the Mexican state of Chiapas, farmers were clearing jungle to plant crops when they stumbled into the ruins of a strange temple. It turned out to be the ruins of Palenque, a Maya city from the 6th century AD. They kept digging, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and more. It became clear the jungle had been hiding the ruins of an extraordinary civilization. But how was it even possible that the Maya's own descendants had no idea this had existed? And here, there's a story worth telling, because Palenque is also where one of the most surprising archaeological discoveries happened. In 1952, a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruiz Lullier noticed something odd in the floor of the temple at the top of one of the pyramids, a stone slab with holes in it. He started digging. After years of excavation, he found a burial chamber beneath the pyramid. Inside lay a Maya king named Pakal, jade mask on his face, jade ornaments on every finger. Before this discovery, scholars assumed Maya pyramids were just temples, no tombs inside. But now it was clear. Just like Egyptian pharaohs, Maya kings built pyramids as their eternal homes. The Egyptians had been doing this for millennia. The Maya had kept it a secret, buried underground for nearly 1,500 years. Let's back up. Here's what happened. When the Spanish conquered Maya lands in the 15th century, they destroyed the local nobility, looted and burned cities, and basically turned the survivors into forced labor. The very word Maya fell out of use. The descendants living on the Yucatan Peninsula called themselves by the Spanish word Indio, just Indians. And then suddenly, it turned out these same lands were covered in ruins of a powerful civilization with pyramids that rivaled or even surpassed those of Egypt. At the time, Mexico belonged to Spain, ruled by King Charles III, a monarch who invested heavily in culture and science. Around the same period, Pompeii had just been excavated in Italy, a Roman city perfectly preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Charles funded those digs and then had a thought. What if there's something equally remarkable in my own territories overseas? Turns out there was. He created a new official position, Historian of the Indies, plural because nobody at the time really thought it through. They'd been looking for a sea route to India, found something else entirely, and just kind of went with it. From that point on, the systematic study of ancient American civilizations began. Throughout the 19th century, European researchers were in a state of genuine cultural shock. The contrast between the contemporary native population and these massive, sophisticated structures was staggering. So the first hypothesis was predictable. Someone, anyone other than the native people, must have built this. The theories were endless. Phoenicians, descendants of Hercules, Celts, Atlanteans. Europeans were ready to believe literally anything rather than admit the indigenous people had built it themselves. Psychologically, they just couldn't accept it. Eventually, thankfully, historians ran out of creative alternatives and gradually concluded, yes, the locals built it. They'd just gone through some rough centuries. So, what does modern science actually say? Here's what we know for certain. The ancestors of the Maya arrived in the Americas tens of thousands of years ago and had to build a civilization from scratch. No familiar animals, no familiar crops, a genuinely parallel world. One interesting detail, according to linguistic analysis, the Maya originally lived somewhere in Northern California, or what's now Oregon, which means a Guatemalan immigrant moving to the US today is, in a sense, just going home. Think about that for a second. Now here's where the terminology gets complicated, because Maya isn't a single people, it's a large group of peoples. Today, about 6 million people identify as Maya. In ancient times, there were at most around 10 million. They were different cities and different groups spread across most of Central America, speaking different languages and with different histories. Think of them like the Germanic peoples, Germans, Swedes, Dutch, all related but completely distinct. And for scale, the largest Maya cities had populations comparable to medieval London or Paris. These weren't villages, they were genuine metropolises of their era. So keep this in mind. If you ever read something about the Lacandon people, keepers of ancient Maya wisdom, that's nonsense. The Lacandons are related to the Maya, but they're a completely different group. with no real connection to the classical Maya civilization. Now, let's talk about the setting, because this is where things get really interesting, an environment that simultaneously made the Maya geniuses and destroyed their civilization. The quick version, to the north, was the Yucatan Peninsula, jungle, intense heat, and almost no rivers. And that's exactly what gave rise to one of the Maya mysteries, the cenotes. Cenotes are sacred wells, massive sinkholes filled with water that the Maya believed led directly to the land of the dead. Sacrifices were made at cenotes, not to the gods, but literally to the wells themselves. In Chichen Itza, for example, there was a sacred cenote nearly 200 feet across. Gold ornaments, valuables, and, during droughts, people too, according to Spanish chronicles. In the 20th century, archaeologists dove to the bottom of one of these wells. They found human bones. But here's the obvious question. What are these things exactly? No rivers, no lakes, just these enormous stone sinkholes full of water. What's going on? The answer is actually pretty straightforward. The Yucatan is essentially one giant limestone slab riddled with voids and cracks. Rainwater seeps in and collects underground. Not much water up top, but plenty below. Under those conditions, cenotes were the only reliable water source. And from there, it's not a big leap to sacred status. Here's one of the most surprising facts about the Maya, discovered only in 2020. It turns out the Maya were purifying the water in these cenotes using zeolite, a natural mineral that filters contaminants and kills bacteria. About 2,000 years ago, they were already using technology that modern science now uses in industrial water filters. For comparison, in medieval Europe at the same time, sewage ran through the streets. Children of the jungle? Try hydrological engineers ahead of their time. The best lands were in the middle. Fertile soil, rivers, warm climate. The Maya called this region the land of the deer because game was abundant: turkeys, peccaries, monkeys. It was here, in what's now Belize, around 1800 BC, that Cacao was founded, the oldest known Maya city. Now, the answer to the wheel question I asked at the start. In Asia and Europe, the wheel was invented to pull carts, but carts need draft animals: horses, donkeys, oxen. The Maya had none of those. No large domestic livestock at all. Not because they were lazy or primitive. Those animals simply didn't exist in Central America. What they did have: turkeys, dogs, pigeons, and ducks. And speaking of dogs, the Maya had dogs for every purpose: guard dogs, companion dogs, and food. Young, castrated male dogs fattened on corn were considered a delicacy. So why invent a wheel when you have nothing to pull it? No reason to. Goods were carried by hand or transported by boat. That's the whole story. Without draft animals, farming looked very different. They had to invent everything from scratch. Corn, for example, is entirely a human creation. Wild corn produces one kernel per cob. Modern corn is the product of thousands of years of selective breeding. Today, it can't even crossbreed with its wild ancestor.
Beyond corn, the Maya grew beans, peppers, and amaranth. And cacao, though not the way we think of it. The Maya made a mildly alcoholic drink from the pulp of the cacao fruit, not from the ground beans. Didn't taste great, apparently, but caffeine plus alcohol, basically the ancient Maya version of a Four Loko. Cacao beans were also used as currency. Early in the Spanish conquest, a Spanish unit robbed a Maya merchant's canoe. They took the gold and threw out the bag of beans. The Maya were baffled. One more detail about everyday life. The Maya kept stingless bees, tiny ones, the size of gnats. They lived in hollowed-out logs hung under the eaves of houses, essentially multi-story hive towers. The honey was valued as medicine and a trade good, another form of currency alongside cacao. In some parts of Mexico and Guatemala, people still raise these bees using the exact same method today.
These conditions, no livestock, primitive farming, a limited crop base, are ultimately what killed Maya civilization. But more on that in a moment. How do we know any of this? Mostly archaeology. There are no written records about the earliest cities. But around 2,000 years ago, the Maya invented writing, and then they couldn't stop. They were obsessed with inscriptions. They labeled everything they could reach: palaces, storage buildings. Every structure got a construction date. Their calendar tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and Venus simultaneously. Their math was complex enough to make a modern accountant's head spin. Speaking of dates, you probably remember the whole 2012 end of the world thing. People were building bunkers, stockpiling supplies. The ancient Maya would have been completely baffled. The whole panic came from a basic cultural misunderstanding. The Maya had a unit of time called a baktun. 13 baktuns made up a sun era, about 5,125 years. In 2012, a new era was simply beginning, a purely astronomical event, interesting mostly to mathematicians and astronomers. No apocalypse. Somewhere in the 1970s, during the New Age movement, some American esotericist latched on to a Maya prophecy, and it snowballed from there. The whole thing was nonsense from the start.
But here's where the calendar story gets even stranger. Because the Maya weren't just tracking the sun, they were obsessed with Venus. To the Maya, Venus wasn't a romantic symbol, it was a war planet. Its appearance in the morning sky was considered an omen, the right moment to launch a campaign, capture a king, or consecrate a new ruler. Maya astronomers tracked Venus for centuries, recording its cycles with obsessive precision. And here's the part that's genuinely hard to believe. They calculated the Venusian year, the time it takes Venus to complete a full cycle as seen from Earth, to within roughly 2 minutes of the value modern science gives us. No telescopes, no instruments beyond the naked eye, a dark sky, and a very long list of observations passed down across generations. For comparison, European astronomers working at the same time with access to Greek mathematical traditions and relatively sophisticated instruments weren't doing better. In some cases, they were doing worse. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, contains a 104-year Venus table that still impresses astronomers today. It's not just a list of dates, it includes correction factors. The Maya noticed their own rounding errors accumulating over decades and built in adjustments to keep the table accurate across centuries. That's not mysticism, that's applied science. Beyond calendrical inscriptions, the Maya recorded coronations, military victories, and major events. They also had books, codices, folded like accordions, made from deer hide. But those books were useless to historians for a long time. Having texts is only helpful if you can read them. And that was a serious problem until the mid-20th century. Decades of research, the best minds in Europe, expeditions into the jungle. Nothing. And then it was solved by a man who'd never been to Mexico, working not in the field, but in an ordinary Moscow office. His name was Yuri Knorozov. And here's the most absurd part of this story. While hundreds of Western scholars spent years hunched over hieroglyphs in the field, the answer had been sitting in plain sight. In the 16th century, a Spanish priest named Diego de Landa compiled a list of Maya glyphs and decided each one corresponded to a letter of the Latin alphabet. Reasonable idea, except he got the fundamental concept completely wrong. A Maya glyph isn't a letter, it's a syllable. One conceptual mistake by one person, and the entire field was stuck for 300 years. Knorozov took de Landa's exact same list, asked the right question, and the language opened up. In 1952, he published a paper that changed everything. The reaction in the West was predictable. How could a Soviet scholar who'd never even seen these jungles understand the Maya better than our own specialists working right there on the Yucatan? He was dismissed for years. But when he presented his decipherment tables, there was nothing left to argue with. Knorozov was right. A complete decipherment still doesn't exist, but we now know enough to read the majority of texts. And when scholars finally opened those books, an entire ancient world opened up with them. Let's go back now to the Yucatan many centuries ago. The most iconic Maya structures are the pyramids. A lot of people want to connect them to Egypt. Pyramids there, pyramids here. The civilizations must have been in contact, right? Nope. This is convergent evolution, the same phenomenon that gives butterflies, birds, and bats all have wings, but those wings are completely different structures with completely different evolutionary histories.
A pyramid is essentially just a mound, the most structurally stable shape you can build. Any pile of earth over a chief's grave is already, in some sense, a pyramid. The logic follows from there. The more powerful the state, the more impressive the ruler wants his burial mound. At some point, someone stacked one mound on top of another, and then another, and you have a step pyramid. Egypt's first pyramid, by the way, the Pyramid of Djoser, was exactly that. The Egyptians later figured out how to smooth the sides into a solid triangle. The Maya never got there. But their pyramids don't suffer for it. The La Danta Pyramid in Guatemala, at around 260 feet tall, is one of the largest in the world. And here's something you can literally hear. Stand at the base of El Castillo at Chichen Itza and clap your hands. The echo that comes back sounds exactly like the chirp of the Quetzal, the sacred bird. Coincidence? Acoustical engineers who've studied the pyramid don't think so. The Maya designed it so the stone itself would speak in the voice of a god. Egypt's Pyramid of Djoser can't do that. Maya pyramids sing. Now, the Maya weren't even the first advanced civilization in the Americas.
The Maya Classic period runs roughly from the 3rd to the 8th century AD, the same era as the fall of Rome and early medieval Europe. By that point, 2 earlier civilizations had already risen and collapsed in Mexico, the Olmec and the Teotihuacan. For the Maya at their peak, these civilizations were as ancient Greece is to us. The Maya considered them their teachers, not their contemporaries. Maya rulers traced their ancestry back to Teotihuacan. Speaking of rulers, the Maya never had a single unified state. In the Classic period, there were dozens of small kingdoms. Each was led by an adyao, literally, the one who speaks loudly. Funny title, honestly, though the Aztec word Tlatoani, meaning ruler, translates roughly the same way. There was apparently something common in how Mesoamerican cultures thought about power. One notable detail, women could be adyao. By any standard of indigenous American civilization, that's remarkably progressive. We don't see anything comparable among neighboring peoples. And here's where it turns into a genuine political thriller. Because relations between Maya cities weren't just wars. This was medieval-level political intrigue played out in the jungle. Cities spied on each other, made secret alliances, betrayed allies at exactly the right moment. Winners erected stelae, stone monuments in the main plazas of conquered cities with inscriptions that essentially read, "We captured their king, we humiliated their gods, they serve us now." It wasn't just about winning, it was about publicly destroying your enemy's reputation. A city might spend years waiting for a neighbor to weaken from internal conflict before striking at exactly the worst moment. Sometimes the winner didn't even kill the conquered king. They left him on the throne as a puppet who paid tribute while pretending to rule. It was basically Game of Thrones, just swap the dragons for human sacrifice.
Now, let's talk about Maya society. There are 2 popular myths. Either the Maya were peaceful, sun-worshipping vegans or bloodthirsty cannibals. In the mid-20th century, a theory developed that the Maya didn't really like fighting. They'd show up, figure out who was tougher, grab some prisoners, and head home. But that came entirely from translation errors. Researchers reading stelae inscriptions saw one-day war and drew the wrong conclusions. Those stelae were celebrating victories, not wars. It's like saying World War II happened on VJ Day in August 1945. We now have enough documentation to be clear. Maya cities fought constant, full-scale wars. Invasions, captured prisoners, burned cities. And yes, there were even fairly large states, like the Conceal Kingdom, which literally translates as Sacred Empire. What about the sacrifices? Half myth, half reality. All Mesoamerican cultures had ritual practices that left the Spanish conquistadors genuinely horrified. Even the mild-mannered rain god Choc was depicted as a monster. The rituals matched. The Maya had a blood cult. They believed the gods literally craved human blood, especially the blood of nobility, which was considered more powerful. The practice looked something like this. A person would pierce their tongue, earlobes, or lips, let the blood drip onto tree bark, and then burn it. The blood was believed to travel with the smoke to the gods. The most dedicated practitioners would push it far enough to induce hallucinations from blood loss. In that kind of society, that was considered direct communication with the divine. But bloodletting wasn't the extreme.
According to archaeological finds, the Maya also used hallucinogenic enemas. Specialized vessels and tubes for this procedure have been found at multiple excavation sites. The mixture was absorbed directly, producing a much faster and more powerful effect than drinking it. A priest could be in a full trance within minutes. From a Western perspective, completely insane. From the Maya perspective, the most efficient way to talk to gods.
And while we're on the subject of bodies and status, Maya nobility had their teeth inlaid with precious stones. Jade, pyrite, turquoise. Using a plant resin adhesive with antiseptic properties. The teeth didn't rot. The stones stayed in place for years. Modern dentists who've examined these findings have been impressed. The technique was genuinely sophisticated. It wasn't just decoration, it was a permanent mark of status, literally embedded in the body. Forever. Unlike the Aztecs, who ran a full-scale sacrifice operation, the Maya weren't there initially. War prisoners were sacrificed, sure, beheaded first, then the rest. But after contact with the Aztecs, the Maya adopted some of their practices. Hearts were ripped from living prisoners, others were tied to trees and shot with arrows, or quartered. After the ritual killing, the priest would skin the body, wear the skin, and dance. The body was eaten. Not exactly a dinner party. Treatment of prisoners varied by status. A brave warrior who held himself with dignity in captivity was treated with respect. They still cut his head off, but respectfully. Particularly high-status prisoners could be held for years while priests waited for the stars to align on the right day. If a prisoner begged for mercy or broke down, they were humiliated and degraded before execution. Now let's talk about the famous ball game. The popular image is that the losing team got sacrificed. That's not quite right. First of all, this wasn't football. The point was to keep the ball moving. The ball represented the sun, which must never stop. There was something like a basketball hoop, but scoring wasn't the main objective. Just keep it in the air. And now about the ball itself. Solid rubber spheres weighing around 220 pounds. About the weight of a full-grown adult, but made of rubber. Players wore stone padding to avoid getting crushed. They hit the ball with their shoulders and hips. Compared to this, rugby is a children's game.
And about that ball, it's worth pausing here. Because rubber itself is one of the most underrated Maya contributions to human civilization. When Europeans first encountered rubber in the Americas, they had no idea what to do with it. It was sticky in heat, brittle in cold, and fell apart within a season. An American inventor named Charles Goodyear spent years trying to figure out how to stabilize it, working obsessively, running up debts, doing experiments on his kitchen stove. In 1839, he finally cracked it: vulcanization, mixing rubber with sulfur under heat. It made him famous, but not rich. He died broke, buried under patent lawsuits. The tire company, Goodyear, by the way, has nothing to do with him personally. It was named in his honor decades after his death by founders who wanted to cash in on the association. He never saw a cent of it. But here's the thing. The Maya had been doing something functionally equivalent for at least 3,500 years before him. They mixed latex from the rubber tree with juice from the morning glory vine, a specific species, Ipomea alba, and the result
was a stable, elastic, durable material. Different chemistry, same principle. Archaeologists have found rubber balls at Olmec and Maya sites dating back to 1600 BC. The Maya weren't just playing a game. They were working with a material that the entire industrialized world would spend centuries trying to recreate and wouldn't manage until the 19th century. Goodyear never knew. The formula was sitting in the jungle the whole time. Ball courts were everywhere. Royal palaces, small towns, you name it. This was mass culture, like soccer in Latin America today. Warriors trained with it instead of going to the gym. As for sacrificing the losing team, there's no evidence of that in the sources, though there was plenty of other grim stuff. Like using a prisoner's severed head, coated in rubber, as the ball. It's worth noting that Maya civilization developed slowly, from a European perspective at least. The first cities appeared around the same time as ancient Egypt, but 2,000 years later, they hadn't seemed to advance much. That's not because they were less intelligent. They were working under far harsher constraints. No rivers like the Nile, no draft animals, no familiar crops. And all of that ultimately led to catastrophe. And then something happened. In the span of a few decades, the civilization simply collapsed. City after city was abandoned, swallowed by the jungle, and stayed that way until the 15th century. This is the real Maya mystery. What happened? No foreign invasion, no volcanic eruption, no epidemic. The civilization just ended.
We don't know much about this period, but some things are clear. In the final decades before the collapse, Maya cities were in total chaos. Dynasties broke down. Unknown figures seized thrones. The bones of that era show that even kings were starving. The food was gone. There's a theory that explains it, and it connects directly to what we talked about earlier. Remember the farming cycle? Burn a section of jungle, plant corn and beans, clear a new section a few years later, repeat. That system only works with a limited population. By the 8th century, Maya cities held several million people, enormous for an agrarian society in a small geographic area. Endless fields surrounded the cities. The soil was exhausted. The forests were gone. One bad harvest, one drought, one stretch of heavy rain, and famine. The Maya became victims of their own success. The more they built and multiplied, the faster they destroyed the very environment that fed them. By the 10th century, classical Maya civilization had ceased to exist. But the Maya themselves didn't disappear, and this matters. There's a persistent myth that the Spanish didn't really conquer the Maya because they'd already destroyed themselves. That's about as wrong as the crystal skull theories, just aimed at a more intellectually pretentious audience. Yes, when the conquistadors arrived, some Maya cities, including Chichen Itza, were already ruins. But the Maya aren't a monolith. The civilization collapsed only in the central zone, in what's now Guatemala. In the north, on the Yucatan Peninsula, cities kept standing. There was a classical Maya civilization, and there was a post-classical one. The northern Maya, oddly enough, survived precisely because their conditions were worse to begin with. Lower population density,
The ecology held. The Spanish had to take them one city at a time. The last independent Maya city, Tayasal, fell only in 1697. For context, in Europe at that point, newspapers were being printed and operas were being performed. But the story doesn't end there, because in the 19th century, something happened that defies easy explanation, except one. The Maya came back.
Here's what happened. In 1847, the Maya of Yucatan launched a rebellion against Mexican authorities. It's called the Caste War. At first, they were winning. They took back almost the entire peninsula. Then, the Mexican military regrouped, and by 1850, the rebels had been crushed, scattered through the jungle, starving, no leadership, no hope. And then, at that lowest possible point, a cross in the jungle started speaking. A man named José María Barrera found a wooden cross carved with words in the jungle. He announced it was a divine sign, that the cross was speaking and saying exactly what the people needed to hear. The Maya were chosen by God. The war would continue. Victory was coming. People came from across the peninsula. The context was perfect. A defeated people living in the jungle with no future. Those are exactly the people most likely to believe in a miracle.
But here's where it gets truly interesting. The cross didn't just inspire, it governed. A designated priest-interpreter read the cross's messages aloud. The cross demanded the war continue. The cross named traitors. The cross promised specific victories in specific battles. Someone very smart was making political decisions and routing them through a religious channel that nobody could argue with. To question the cross was to question God. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine religious phenomenon or a calculated operation, because the cross apparently spoke through a small hole in the back wall of the shrine. Some researchers believe a person was simply hiding back there, whispering the right words at the right moment. If that's true, it's one of the most sophisticated political tricks in the history of the Americas. Either way, it worked. A whole city grew up around the talking cross, Chan Santa Cruz. An army formed. The state held out for decades, repelling one Mexican military expedition after another. People believed, partly because the cross promised victories, and victories did happen. It's a closed loop. Faith gives strength, strength gives victory, victory reinforces faith. The Mexican government didn't finally eliminate this state until the early 20th century, and it took machine guns and armored trains to do it. So here's where I'll leave you. The Maya aren't ancient ruins. There are almost 6 million of them alive today. A people who survived ecological catastrophe, feudal warfare, and conquest, and still kept themselves together. They didn't vanish into the jungle. They're just waiting for their moment.